This lesson is Introduction to CSS Layout. In this lesson, you'll learn about the CSS float and clear properties and how they're used to create columns within a CSS layout. This lesson is intended for viewers who need to learn the basics of HTML and CSS or simply need a refresher. Lessons specifically related to HTML5 begin with our Lesson 6 video using HTML5 markup. So to begin with, let's take a look at the concept of floating in CSS. Now I'm working with a lesson file here. You don't have access to this file. This is really more just for demonstration purposes, and then we'll take a look at our lesson files. But what we have here is an inline graphic. This graphic here of the blueberry smoothie is between our headings and our paragraphs. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a float property to this graphic, and we'll see how it's affected on the page. So first, let's go to our code. And let's take a look at the structure of our HTML. So again, here we have our heading 1, our heading 2, here's our image, and then we have our 2 paragraphs following. So within my CSS, I currently have a rule for images within the main div. This is currently targeting that blueberry smoothie image, and there's a property that says float none, which is the default property of floats. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to change the value from none to right, and then we're going to go look at this when I reload the page. So with that image floated to the right, it's removed from the flow of HTML, and it moves all the way to the right-hand side of the screen. At the same time, these paragraphs jump up, and this tells us that this image is essentially floated and that text is replacing that position. Now, if I come back to my code and I change the value from right to left, and I reload the page, we'll now see that that image shifts to the left and the 2 paragraphs are on the right-hand side. So again, what this tells you is that the float property removes the objects that it's affecting out of the normal flow of HTML. There's no better way to see how this affects objects than by taking that image and putting it a little further down. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to the code. I'm going to copy that entire image element. I'll actually cut it. And I'm now going to place it between those 2 paragraphs. So previously it was above the first paragraph. Now it's going to be between paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. Remember, it still has a float left property applied. Now when I go into the browser and I reload, we can see that the text flows or wraps around it. However, something else interesting happens as well. If you'll notice here, the height of that graphic is extending beyond the container that it's within. So this is further illustration that whenever you float an object, you're removing it from the traditional flow of HTML. In this case, it's breaking out of its container. That container is not expanding. This will have ramifications later on when you're trying to create columns in HTML and CSS. So to get a better sense of how this works, let's go ahead now, and you can open up the 04 layout.start.html file. However, I've done a few things here just to speed things up. Let's take a look at the file as I've created it. So here I have a number of div elements, and I've currently styled the header div and the navigation div and the wrap div. So the wrap div is containing all of the other elements within the page. What we're now going to focus on are the sidebar div and the main div. So let's go back to our code here. And again, I'm going to cheat a little bit by taking this entire rule for the sidebar and putting this into my internal style sheet. Let's just take a quick look at what this rule does. We're currently defining the ID named sidebar and telling it to float to the left and give it a width of 300 pixels and a background color. Let's save our file. Again, just to remind you of what that sidebar div is, we're going to go into our HTML. So here's our div. It contains a few headings and a few paragraphs, but let's look at it in the browser. And there we go. We can see that This gray area here represents the sidebar. We gave it a width, it's floating to the left, and the section to the right, this main content, has kind of filled in the gap as well. Additionally, we can see that similar behavior. We can see that the height of that sidebar is extending beyond the container. And again, this is something important to keep in mind, and we'll come back to this in just a moment. But for now, let's go ahead and float the main section. I'm going to take this entire section of code here and put it into my internal style sheet. So in a similar fashion, we're simply saying to the main ID, float to the right, give it a width of 600, and give it a background color. When I open it up in the browser, this is now what we have. So we have a 600 pixel wide main section, and something else interesting happened. The footer div has now slid up underneath, or seemingly underneath, the left column and the right column. Now, if you remember back to my other floating example, this makes sense. The left and the right column are removed from the traditional flow of HTML. That footer essentially ignores the fact that those two columns exist, and it slides right up. So what we need is another property that tells the footer to ignore elements that are floated. So this is the clear property. And the clear property would look something like this. Take this code here, copy it, put it into my style sheet, and now we're simply saying to the footer div, I would like to clear everything on the right of you. And we also give it a background color. Now, if we go ahead, reload, we can see exactly what's happening now. That footer is looking pretty good, at least as far as that right-hand column is concerned, but that left-hand column is still overlapping it. So to fix that, we have three options for clears. We can say clear to the right, clear to the left, or in this case, clear both. What this is essentially saying is you don't want to allow anything floated on the left or the right of the footer. So let's save it. Let's reload our page. And now we're in good shape. That footer shifts to the bottom, and there's nothing floated on either the left or the right-hand side. In this case, the columns. Now there's obviously much more to look at when it comes to the fundamentals of layout. But for now, you've learned a little bit about the CSS float and clear properties and how they're used to create columns within a CSS layout.